So this is going to be starting a brand new section, and we're actually going to be looking at a very cool and useful feature in CSS. Now, of course, this isn't a very old or considered a essential feature, but it's still very useful and it can help you make your website look a lot better. So in this section, we're going to be covering everything to do with movement on your page. So things like animations, transitions, and some other features that you can use to sort of change the way your website looks without actually changing it, in a sense. Now, of course, this will make a lot more sense once we go forward and start working with some of the properties. But the first one I want to talk about in this video is our transition property. So there is a lot to cover in this video, and transition is actually a shorthand for 4 different properties. So there's going to be a lot to work with and talk about. So I'm going to go through it a little bit slow, but once you get to the end of this video, you'll understand everything about transitions and how to work with them. Now you can see I've touched up this website a little bit using all of the skills that we've learned in this section: selectors, displays, margins, all sorts of things like that, including styling the button just with a little creativity. And now we have our page kind of a little bit better laid out for our animations. So the main part that we're going to be focusing on is our contact us section, and notably our submit button. So this is the main kind of focus piece of this section. So pretty much right now we have a static page. There's nothing moving, nothing changing positions or properties or anything like that. And right now what I want to do is focus on the submit button to create some transitions. Now pretty much what's going to happen is we're going to use pseudo selectors to change the state of this button, or change some of the properties in it. So for example, the background or the text color or anything like that. And then we're going to use the transition property to make it appear smooth. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The transition property itself isn't that big of a deal, but the real work goes behind the pseudo selectors and how you use them. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is use a pseudo selector to change, let's just go with the background for now. So what I'm going to do is use my class that I added. You can go ahead and add this on your own if you're following along. And then I'm going to use a pseudo selector, and I'm just going to say for now, let's go with hover, which is a pretty common pseudo selector. Now just to test that this works, I'm going to change the color to black, because again, there could always be issues. Let's refresh, hover, it's black. You can see that it's already working. It's just not smooth. So let's go through and start changing some of these properties. What I'm going to do is change the background to a lighter shade. I'm actually going to just use the color picker here. I'm going to go ahead and use a lighter shade of blue, something that would indicate that you're hovering over. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And for now, we're just going to stick with one property. But once we go forward, we're actually going to add more and more properties to make it look a lot cleaner. Let's go ahead and refresh, see if that works. You can see that it is a much lighter shade and it looks like a proper hover on a website. So let's get started. Now we have our submit button, or our base class, the one that's always active, and our special pseudo class, which kind of uses specificity to override our base class in certain conditions. In this case, the hover. Now what we're going to do is add our transition property. So what we do is go to our base class, and we're going to set our transition property here. And now we have a bunch of different values to input. The first is going to be the property that you want to, well, transition. Because remember, the property is basically going to smooth it out and move the property on one hand, or from the base class, slowly to the other in a nice, clean, animated way. So if you want to select all of your properties, you can just hit all, but I wouldn't recommend that unless you want to shorten things or smooth over time, because sometimes your classes can change and it can cause errors in the long run. So what I would do is, for now, I'm just going to select the specific property that I want. Next thing I want to talk about is the duration. So this is pretty much the time it's going to take to move from one property or one value to the other. Now this can be anything. Now you would specify this in seconds or milliseconds depending on what you want to choose. I'm going to go ahead and use seconds. So I'm going to say 2 seconds. And S, by the way, is the unit for seconds, in case you didn't know. The next we want to go is talk about the sort of transition style. So this is probably the most complicated thing to work with because there's a lot of different styles and we haven't really used them in daily life, but it's pretty easy. Pretty much what you're going to do is decide what kind of a change do you want it. Do you want it to go straight from A to B? Do you want it to be smooth or speedy? And what I'm going to do is just run through some of the main ones you have here. So the first one and the most common one is going to be ease. Oh, whoops, I'm not typing. Ease. And pretty much what this does is it's kind of the standard transition. It goes straight from A to B. Then you have linear, which is not very commonly used, especially in transitions, but it just goes straight from A to B without any, speed changes or anything like that. And you also have a couple more. There is one called ease in out, like this. And you can pretty much just read this in name. It eases using the previous one that I just talked about, but of course in that order. So those are pretty much the the four common ones that you would use. And of course there's a bunch more, but these are really the main ones that you would work with here. So pretty much let's start working with our transition property here. So I'm actually going to go with ease in out just to spice it up a little bit, not use the basic ones. And then the last property that we're going to select is the delay. So pretty much what's going to happen is when you hover over it right now, there's no delay. It's 0 seconds. The animation plays instantly. But what you can actually do is set a delay that you can use to, let's just say after you hover, to wait 2 seconds and then play the animation. So let's just go ahead and set a delay of 1 second. And that off with the semicolon. Lot to digest there, I know, but don't worry about it. Just keep it there for now. And if you don't understand it, we'll break it down and do some more examples. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. So what I'm going to do is hover over my button here. You can see that it's going to wait. Oh, whoops. So I'm going to hover over. And now we're going to wait. And you can see after 1 second, it turns into that kind of shade that we wanted. Now I feel like we're going to remove that 1 second delay because we don't need it. And I'm actually going to shorten this down to 0.5 seconds. Now what I'm going to do is refresh the page. And now you can see it's a lot faster. Now once you get into this range, you want to start using milliseconds. So I'm going to go 300 ms, which is milliseconds. Let's refresh the page. And like I said, just play around with this, tinker with it, and see how it works. So you can see when we do this that it changes the color, and when we hover over, it changes back. So now you can see the difference between not having a transition and having it. Let's comment this out for a second. And you can see how that works. Without the transition, it looks kind of jarring and quick and sharp. It doesn't really look appealing. But when you add that transition, it just completely changes everything. Now, why don't we go ahead and try out some of the other styles, because it's much easier to show you how these styles works rather than just explaining them. So let's go ahead and see linear. So pretty much what's going to happen, it just goes straight from A to B, no speed changes or anything. Of course, with something this small, it's not very noticeable, but when you have translations and all these different changes, then it will definitely be noticeable. So there you go, you have a linear transition there. Now let's go ahead and try our ease transition. Refresh it. And you can see that it is a lot faster and, like I said, not very noticeable, but we can see a clear difference in the speed and agility, or well, not agility, but the kind of curves of the transition. It starts out very fast. Towards the middle, it gets a little bit slower, and then towards the end, it's much faster. Now, of course, it would be easier to demonstrate if it wasn't 300 milliseconds. Let's go ahead and see this when it is on a higher time. So you can see kind of how that works there. So there we go. Those are the different types of transition types. That's probably the hardest value to work with. And then after that, everything becomes a lot simpler. So now let's go ahead and start adding some more properties here to make this a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and add some padding. So I'm going to say when it's hovered over, pretty much double the padding. So 20 pixels, 30 pixels. Now here what we're going to do is either use a comma to separate the different properties that we want to use, or we can just erase all of this and say all. Now we refresh it, and you can see that that gets a lot bigger. Let's change that back to about 500 milliseconds. Make that a lot shorter. And now you can see it gets bigger. On top of that, the background changes. Now, of course, you can do so many different changes with this. You can maybe change the color, the font size, even the weight. And once we learn some of the transformation functions, we can do a lot more with it. But for now, we need to stick with the basics of the transition concept. So before we move on, there's one thing I need to talk about, and those are the prefixes that we need to use for browser support. So the thing is, with much newer CSS versions, is that not all browsers support them. They all compile in a different way, and some of them don't support these newer properties, especially in the older versions. So for example, Internet Explorer 7, Internet Explorer 8, all of those very old browsers which people still use won't be able to see this property. Now you have two solutions to this. Either use a fallback, which is, if the transition doesn't work, just maybe have a fallback image or don't play it at all. Or you can use a browser support prefix. So each one, or each type of browser, has a different prefix, but the main ones are for Chrome and Safari. We need to use WebKit like this. And remember, you need to start it with a dash and end it with a dash like this. Then the one for Mozilla Firefox is going to be -moz. And then, of course, for some of the other browsers like Opera, you would use O. Oh, whoops, wrong line. You would use O for that. And those are pretty much the three main ones. Now, WebKit is pretty much an essential. It covers two browsers at once. Now, of course, and Mozilla is also still important. Opera is important, but not as important as these other two. Now, one thing you need to note is you can't just string these together. You can't go -WebKit, -moz, -o. You have to use separate properties. So you have to go and copy each one, and it is a pain, but if you want the maximum browser support, you need to do this. So of course, if we refresh the page, nothing's going to happen here, but anybody who's using an older browser, if I was testing this on maybe Internet Explorer 7, would see a clear difference between before and after we added these browser support prefixes. So that's pretty much it for transitions. Now, there is a lot to cover, and we will work with them throughout the future. But all you need to do is go ahead, select pretty much any element you want, and start playing around with it. Add some different properties, maybe go and change the pseudo selector. So for example, if you want it to be active or something like that, or if you click it, you want to change some of these properties. There's a bunch of pseudo selectors out there, and combining that with the transition property and the skills you've learned in CSS, you can really make this website or whatever website you're working on interactive without even having to learn any animation or proper transformation properties. All right, let's move on.